Hello, welcome to White Davy Garden and Worm Farm. Today we are going to be discussing some questions regarding worm farming. So, how are you guys doing? Hopefully, you are doing well. Okay, so we're going to look at first, we're going to start off by doing a small comparison of the difference between compost and castings. We sometimes, especially for people who are just getting familiar with the term castings, they tend to use it interchangeably with worm castings with compost. They are not the same. They are similar because both are made from the same product, from food scraps, from your garden waste, from using worm chow. So they're pretty much made from the same thing, using your shredded paper, your shredded newspapers, stuff like that. But the difference is that the castings is actually the byproduct of worms. So composting with worms, it's actually the worm poop. So that is the difference between the two. Although they're made from the same products, it is worm casting is actually the poop of the worms. Now, if this is a question that people ask sometimes, like if I'm going to be using compost in my garden, do I still need to use castings? Well, I would recommend if you're using compost that you still use castings because yes, you can do without castings, but the benefit that you get from using worm casting far outweighs the benefit that you would get from using compost. For example, when you use compost in your garden, it does have beneficial microbes, it does have nutrients that your plants need. It is not slow releasing, however, and the worm casting, on the other hand, can have up to 5 times more nutrients than the compost, and it have more microbes than the compost. So later on in the discussion, I'm going to be discussing some of the benefits of having microbes in your garden, and then you're going to see, based on these benefits, why it is important to have the worm casting because of the amount of microbes that are actually in the castings. So nutrients in compost, it gets deleted in the garden much faster than the nutrients that is in castings. And that is because the worm castings, as it passes through the alimentary canal of the worms, it gets encapsulated in the enzymes that are in the stomach or the alimentary canal of the worms. And so this is actually a oily enzyme. So as it wraps itself around or as it coats the castings, it takes 2 months for this enzyme to fully break down. So during this breakdown process, as the enzyme breaks down, the casting release more and more and more nutrients. Oh, hi, Granny Garden. I'm doing okay. How are you? It's good to see you. Yes, so it takes 2 months for it to break down fully. So it allows the casting to release the nutrients over a 2 months period. Not to mention the fact that for your compost, if you use a lot of compost, you can actually use too much and it burn your plants. Whereas if you're using worm castings, no matter how much you use, if you want to put a whole gallon of castings on one plant, it will not burn your plant. So that is why it is so good to have the worm castings in your garden. Not to mention that it acts as a pest for pest control, as you may have seen in my video yesterday. So these are benefits that you don't necessarily get from using compost. So again, the answer to the question, if you're using compost in your garden, should you still use worm castings? Yes. So people use the compost to make compost tea, and they use the castings to make worm tea. Both of them are very good. When you use the compost to make tea, you water your plants with that and the plant gets the nutrients right away. When you use the worm castings, however, to make the worm tea, if you use that to water the foliage of your plants, then that is one of the areas where it's going to be working as a pest control. Market does not control every type of pest, but it will act as a pest control. So the worm tea over the worm castings, definitely worth it. Let's see. My granny garden says, I am well. Thank you for asking. Okay, good. Now, what happens when castings get frozen? And this is something that I've touched on many times, both in videos and in lives, but there are always new viewers on the live and new people who are new to worm farming. So you will find that on my live, a lot of times I will have a lot of things that I keep repeating. And this is for the benefits of those who are either new to this discussion or new to worm farming, to ensure that everyone has enough information so that they can get the full benefit of either running the worm farm or using the worm castings. Hi, Helpy, how are you? Right, so what happens when worm castings get frozen? Well, the microbes that are in the castings will die, so you don't want to freeze your casting. And again, as I said earlier on, I'm going to be discussing the different types of microbes and the benefits that each of them bring to your garden. So stay tuned for that. So that is why when you hear these reasons, then you're going to see the importance of not freezing your castings. Okay, you're doing well, Helpy. That's awesome. I'm doing okay. I'm a bit frustrated, but I'm okay. I'm having some crazy bipolar weather. For example, yesterday was -4. I got stuck turning on the road that was just all ice. And then it took me about hour and a half. I had 5 guys trying to push me out and it didn't work. I had to call a wrecker to pull me out. And then the day before that, we had -47. So one day -47, the next day we had -4. So it's rather frustrating living in these regions. But what can I do? It's just another part of life, right? Yes, but apart from that, I'm doing okay. Yes, so if your castings get frozen, can it still be used in your garden? The answer is yes. People who produce compost, they don't take their compost inside into a warm environment. They leave the compost outside in their compost bin, unless, of course, they are composting indoors. And that is what they use every year. So it's the same thing with your casting. So all the nutrients that is in the castings will remain. The only thing is that you no longer have the microbes in it. LP says, oh no, you got stuck and you had to call the record. Oh my gosh, that's not good. That is some wacky weather. Wow, wacky indeed. Yeah. Yes, I agree with you, my granny's garden. It is unpredictable and it is worldwide that it is unpredictable because where is it? The Middle East, that is more desert than anything else. They had temperatures that were so low, the lowest it has been in 40 years, resulting in death of kids and others, and people are in critical situation over there. So it's just the entire world that is chaotic weather-wise. But in the future, it will get better. So we just have to look forward to the future. Keep our hopes up. Yes. So although the microbes die, it's still the casting still contains the nutrients. Now, given that the casting have a lot of nutrients than the compost, it will still be very effective in the garden. Now, if you sell your castings, then you don't want to sell those that have froze, that were frozen, because if you do that, then even though they're still getting the additional nutrients because it is worm casting as opposed to compost, they would not be getting the amount of microbes that they should be getting. So if you sell your casting and for whatever reason your casting froze, then I'd recommend not selling it. If you want to get rid of it, if you want to sell it, then I would recommend being honest and saying, okay, I'm going to discount this by whatever percentage because the casting was frozen. So you can still sell it, but you have to be clear as to why what happened to the castings and just sell it at a discounted price. Let's see. Helpy says, did you ever look into using dried worm castings? A long time ago, I mentioned buying some dried worm castings from the store before I started worm farming. Do you think it's the same as freezing, no microbes? Yes, if you allow your casting to dry out, because microbes depend on moisture and it depends on temperature. So if it has good temperature where it's not freezing and if it has enough moisture in it, then it's going to have the microbes. But if it's allowed to dry it out, your microbes are going to die off. So I would not recommend buying the dry castings unless of course you just want it for the nutrients. I'm going to be doing deeper research on to what extent the microbes in your worm casting die off, because there is something that just keeps bugging me about that. Yes, they will die off, they will freeze if you they will die if you allow them to freeze, but do they all die? That is something that I really need to look into. And the reason that I'm thinking about this is because microbes lives outdoor. And if they're living outdoors in areas that freeze, where do they come from the following year? So they could it be that maybe the ones that are deep down survive and the ones that are in the freezing region, those die, but those that are deep down will eventually come up. Is that the case? Or is it that maybe some of them might survive? It is something that I need to look into, because having the answer to that will help to understand more about the microbes in castings when castings freeze. Do we lose all the microbes or what? The good thing is that if you, oh, hi, Princess Lillian. Yes, I'm glad that you were able to join us. LP says, good question. They might go dormant. Yes, that is a possibility that they do go dormant. But based on my research so far, the ones that are in the castings die. So if they freeze, that is. So dormancy, I don't think they would go dormant, but then maybe outdoors deeper down where it is not as cold or it's not frozen, maybe those ones go dormant. Maybe the ones on the surface freeze. I don't really know. So it is something that I am going to be looking into over the course of this year and the next few years to come. I'm going to be doing some really in-depth investigation, talking to people who do this professionally, who study worms professionally, to see how much I can gather from them so I can share it with you, because it is good to fully understand what's going on with the worm casting so that we can get the best outcome from it. So hopefully I'll be able to get some good information to share with you guys. It would be nice if they do go dormant though and not all die off. Okay, so mites and springtails are often found in worm castings in a worm bin. So can they survive in the harvested castings? They certainly can, because harvested castings, there it's never really 100% castings. It's close depending on when you harvest the castings. If you harvest it after the worms have consumed, as far as you can see, most or all of the food scraps. Now, the thing is that while the worms are working on the material that you feed them, the material is still composting, it is still breaking down without the benefit of the worms. So, when you are sifting your castings, those that are broken down that the worms did not eat yet, that are as fine as the worm casting is, those are going to be going through your sift into the worm casting as well, which means that the worms are going to have the worms, the mites, the springtails, whatever insect is in your worm bin is going to have this material that they can feed on. The good thing is that the worms eat faster than these material breakdowns, so it will be compared to the actual worm castings and the food particles that are in the castings. The worm casting is going to drastically outweigh these, and there's nothing you can do about it, that you're going to have those tiny food particles in there. There's nothing you can do about it. The only solution you can have is to make it 100% worm casting, is to, after you've harvested the casting, you put a few worms in the castings and let them stay in there and just work on the material and then extract them later. So that is the only way that you can get 100% worm castings, which, if you have the time to do that, then fine, but not really required. Yes, it's not necessary. So these springtail and mites, they can survive in your harvested casting for a good period of time, provided that they have enough moisture and these food particles to eat. But once that has become depleted, then they will either exit the worm castings, or if they choose to stay, then they will die of starvation. So for a period of time, they can survive in the harvested castings. Let's see, LP says, have you read the book Teeming with Microbes? I have not yet, but I'd like to. A lot of gardeners have recommended it. No, I have never read it. Sounds like it's the first I'm actually hearing about it. Sounds like a very interesting book to read. Um, let's see. I just need to jot down the name. Yeah, that sounds like a very, very nice book to read. Gonna have to see if I can get my hands on a copy of it. Thanks for that. Okay, so let's see. My granny garden says, so the worm castings that we purchase from the big box stores, nurseries. So the worm castings that we purchase from the big box stores and nurseries, good quality. Yes, the quality of your castings depend on quite a lot of things. It depends on what the worms are fed. It depends on conditions that the casting was allowed to go through. Did they allow the castings to dry out fully at some point in time, or did they keep it moist? Do they keep it properly aerated? Stuff like that. So the quality depends on the circumstances or what the casting was exposed to. It also depends on how it is stored in terms of, is it somewhere where it can get exposed to chemicals that are used in the surrounding areas. There are so many things that can affect the quality of our castings. Um, so if you have a worm bin or a worm farm, and you this week you're feeding your worms maybe food scraps, say leafy green vegetables. Next week you're feeding them oranges, and next time you're feeding them something else, and you don't keep it consistent. If you don't keep what you're feeding your worms consistent, that is also going to affect the quality of your castings. The good thing is that most of these big box stores that sells bulk castings, if they are the ones that are producing it, that is, or if they are buying it from large suppliers, then these large suppliers usually have a consistent menu for their worms. So you should be getting very good quality castings from them. But for us, or for most, or for some domestic worm farmers, the quality of their worm casting changes depending on what they are feeding the worms. Hi, Barnfree. How are you? My worm bin is in the garage and it's freezing outside. Will the worms, um, I think your device that you're typing on made a typo there, so I don't know what the last part of the last word in that sentence is. So if you can retype that, that would be awesome so I can understand your question. Sorry about that. So I'm not okay, okay. Will the worms be okay? Is your garage heated, or what's happening? Is the garage heated where you can keep them warm? Or if your garage is not heated, outside is freezing, but the garage is at a temperature where it is above freezing. If the temperature in your garage is at least 10 degrees Celsius, I am not sure what that is in Fahrenheit. Yeah, so if the temperature in your garage is 10 degrees Celsius, then your worms will be fine. If it is 5 or below, then your worms are going to die. And depending on the type of worms you have, for example, if you have African nightcrawlers and blue worms, chances are they will die. I'm not sure about the blue worm cocoons because I've never really raised blue worm cocoons and I've never really done a lot of research on them. The African nightcrawler cocoons, if they freeze, they will die. If it is European nightcrawlers or the red wigglers that you have, then the worms may die, but the cocoons will survive even if they freeze. They will just be dormant until the time warms up, and then as soon as it warm enough, the cocoons will start hatching. So you have red wigglers. Okay, what is the temperature in your garage? That is what you need to keep in mind now. So 10 degrees. So they will slow down drastically almost to the point where it is as if they're hibernating. Yeah, so it will almost be to the point where it's as if they're hibernating. They don't hibernate. I don't remember the term that is used for the process that they go through. So they will still be processing material in the worm bin, but they will be doing so at a drastically reduced rate. So I did a video, I think that was, let's see, today's Friday. I did a video on Wednesday that tells what you can do to keep your worms warm if you're living in cold regions. So you might want to check that out because it made some really good suggestion there. Now there are many things that you can do to keep them warm. So I'd recommend checking out that video because it gives you a lot of options, because some options can be expensive, some can be cheap, some can be where it doesn't really cost you anything. Let's see. Okay, so you don't know what the temperature is in your worm bin. I mean, in your garage. Okay, so one of the things that I recommend that you do if you have your worm bin, is your worm bin full, or does it have a small amount of material and worms in there? Because if you have a lot of space in your worm bin, for one, you could always add dried leaves to it or bedding, or you can add, because there would be slowing down at this point in time. I would not recommend adding a lot of nitrogen rich food or a lot of food scraps to the bin if it is cold in the garage, because what is going to happen if you try to use the food scraps, especially those that are rich in nitrogen, to warm up the bin, is that the worms, the environment around the bin is cold. So what is going to happen is that the worms will slow down even though you're heating up the bin with that method. So you're going to end up with the food going anaerobic, and that is what you don't want. It's going to be, as it breaks down, it might attract pests to your worm bin. So I don't recommend using that method, but dried leaves or other beddings or stuff, pad up the bin, that might help. Yes, but I do recommend you check out that video because it has quite a few suggestions that you can follow. Okay, so let's see. Now, what about stirring your castings that you have harvested that you won't be able to use for the next growing season? Will you actually need to stir it? It's not really necessary, but it is beneficial to occasionally stir that castings. And two reasons why it is beneficial is that, for one, you're very welcome, Barnfree. For one, when you stir it, as you know, castings has to be kept moist. You don't want it to be wet. You want it to be just moist. Worm casting does not require the amount of moisture that your worm bin requires. It just need to be moist. Just a little, not a lot. So depending on the method that you use to keep your castings moist, you may or may not have a lot of moisture in the container that you're storing it in. So when you turn that castings, the bottom will be moisture at all times. So when you turn it, sometimes you don't have to add the extra moisture, because the damp portion on the bottom will moisten the portion that was on the top. And two, you're aerating the castings at the same time, giving the microbes a fair chance to build their population and to keep growing. So those are some of the benefits of occasionally turning your castings. You don't have to do it very often, and you don't have to moisten your castings very often either, unless of course you're using a sprayer and you're just dampening the surface briefly. Yes, so those are the benefits. Let's see. Helpy says, Barnfree, you can get a thermometer pretty cheap. I bought a meat thermometer and keep it in my blue worm bin in my basement gets down to 50, which is 10 degrees C. Okay, so that's 50 Fahrenheit. Okay. Yes, good point, LP. Yes, so now let's look at the benefits of having microbes in your garden. So to get to the benefit of microbes in the garden, we're going to look at it from a viewpoint where we're going to be discussing the various types of microbes that can be found in your garden. First off, you should know that there are beneficial microbes and there are parasitic microbes. So, fungi, some people say fungi. Fungi is one of the microbes that can be found in your worm castings or in your soil. Let's see, Helpy says, I just did a large feeding, still there after a week, but the temp is reading 85 a couple days ago, about 30. Okay, about 30 C's. Okay, that's fairly warm. Yeah, that's fairly warm. Wow. Can you send some of that warmth to me? I'd gladly take it. Yeah, so fungi, these live in the root zone of your plants and it helps to make the nutrients available to your plants. One such example of these fungi that live in the root zone of your plants is the mycorrhizae. So you want to have the fungi in your garden. The next thing, or in your castings, the next one is bacteria. Now, bacteria is considered to be one of the most beneficial life form in the soil or in your castings, and they are responsible for the final stages in breaking down nutrients so that your plants can absorb it through the roots. And the next one is nematodes. Now, these are microscopic worms that lives close to or inside of your plants. Now, they can be either parasitic or they can be beneficial. Now, the beneficial nematodes, these will actually feed on the pathogenic nematodes and release the nutrients from them so that the plants can have it. Yeah. Okay. Barnfree says, thank you. It is colder than 50 degrees. Okay. And LP says, unfortunately, only my worms are warm. Okay. 21 degrees Fahrenheit, -6 here. Okay. Yes. So, yeah, so we look at the nematodes as well. So the next one is the protozoa. Now, these love to feed on bacteria, and then the nutrients that the protozoa gets from the bacteria is released by the protozoa, and the plants will be able to use it. Now, the next one, with a very funny name that's hard to call. Let's see, Barnfree say, can I use a plant eating pad? Yes, you can. That is one of the methods that was suggested in the video. You can use a heating pad to heat up your worm bin. Yes, so the fifth and final type of nematodes, sorry, microbes that we're going to be looking at is the actinomycetes. And these were once classified as a fungi because they are similar to fungi in the soil. Some of them are parasitic while others are beneficial. Oh, hi, Cece, how are you? Yes, some of them are parasitic, some of them are beneficial. Now, the parasitic actinomycetes, mycetes, these are harmful to your plants, while the beneficial ones are like antibiotic for your plants. So far, do you see the importance of having beneficial microbes in your worm castings? Beneficial microbes will actually help with the rate of germination. It helps your plant to develop a good root system. Okay, you're doing well, CC. That's excellent. Yes, it helps your plant to develop a good root system, and it protects your plants from pathogen. It helps your plant to absorb nutrients, thus improving the yield of your plants. So that is why when you have your worm castings, you want to ensure that you do all you can to prevent it from freezing, because you want to have as many of those microbes as you possibly can. Now, bad microbes will either kill your plants or damage it. They can also decrease the yield of your plants. So you want to have those beneficial microbes because they are going to help to keep the bad microbes under control. Now, if you find that you have your castings and for whatever reason it freezes, I recently learned that you can increase the amount of microbes that are in that casting that was frozen by adding a few worms and some food scraps to the castings. But the thing is that you will not have the amount of microbes that you would have had otherwise if the casting didn't freeze. But at least doing so will increase the amount of microbes that you have in the castings. But I'd strongly recommend doing your best not to let the castings freeze. So now I'm going to be addressing some questions that are asked by quite a few beginner gardeners. So one person wanted to know why, after adding food to their worm bin, the worms haven't touched the food for a whole month. Now, there are several things that could be happening. For example, if the food scraps is very acidic, then the worms may tend to avoid it. They will try to feed on everything else in the bin before actually touching the acidic food. Or if they're eating the acidic food along with the other material that is in the bin, they will eat the acidic food at a much slower rate. Okay, just saying greetings. Now, if the food scrap is fresh, the worms will feed on all the food scraps that are in the bin first. Or if you, when you created the bin, if you had the bin, inoculated the bin initially, then the material that is inoculated is what the worms are going to go for first. The worms will always go for the bacteria more than they would go for the food scraps. And the reason for that, I think, notice I said I think, is because the bacteria that is on the food, they don't have to be processing that. It's easy to break down, whereas the food scraps will take some time for them to break down. So who wouldn't want to go for the easier method first, right? LP says, that's really interesting information about the microbes. Thank you. Okay, you're very welcome. Yes, so if the worms could also be feeding on the bedding first before they get to the food scraps that you put in the bin, or if the bin is overrun by some insects such as white mites or the red mites, and the red mites are parasitic to your worms, then the worms will try to stay away from the food source because that is where the mites and other pests in the bin are going to be gathered. So that is why it is important to try to control the population of these mites or other insects that may affect the worms. Now, not all insects in your worm bin is bad. Most of them are very good composters. Most of them are harmless, but there are those that can be harmful in your worm bin. So, and some of them that are harmless, their presence still indicate that something is not right in your worm bin. Not all of them, but some of them are an indication that something is wrong in your worm bin. So you may need to check out what is it that is causing these worms to shy away from the food source. Because worms don't usually take a whole month to process what you put in a worm bin, or even to, depending on how much you feed them and how many worms you have in the worm bin, of course. Because if you have a small amount of worms and you put a lot more food than the worms can eat, it will actually look as if they're not doing anything with the food scraps. But if you had the right amount of food scraps for the amount of worms that you have in your bin, then that should be okay. So if you see that it is taking a whole month for it to even look as if they're processing the food, it means that something is not right in the bin and you need to check that out. Let's see. Um, you're asking if you can keep the eating pad on for 24 hours. Um, I've never really used the Eat Pad. I know that there are a lot of people who use it for their worm farm. So I've never done any in-depth research on that. So I cannot tell you yes or no where that is concerned. What I do know, however, is that you being able to keep it on 24/7 may depend on how hot that heat mat gets, and it may also depend on whether or not you can control the temperature of that heat pad, because some of the heat pads can be temperature can be controlled, some not. But I think you should be, depending on the temperature, you should be able to keep it on 24/7, because if you are using it for seedlings, if you would keep your seedlings on it for 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, then you can keep it for your worms on it. If you would not keep your seedlings on it for that time, then I would not recommend keeping your worm bin on it. One of the things that you can do is, if you're going to be keeping it on it regularly and you do not have the option to adjust the temperature, is to turn the content of your worm bin frequently, so that it's not just hot on the bottom all the time and cooler on the top, but you want to turn the content of your worm bin regularly. Because one, if it is too hot at the bottom and cool at the top, then the worms are going to be migrating upwards. They won't be processing the material that is on the bottom if it is too hot for them. I don't know, I've never really used a heat mat, so I don't know um, whether you would be able to put something between the heat mat and your worm bin if the heat mat gets too hot, to buffer the temperature. So those are some options that you can consider. Now, if you don't already have a heat mat and you want to use it for your worms, then I'd recommend get those that you can control the temperatures of it, because once you can control the temperature of it, then you may be able to keep it on the mat, the worm bin on the mat 24/7. Another thing that you can do, if you already have a heat mat and you're not sure, apart from doing research to find the answers to that, you can choose to the coldest hours of your day. So whether it's going to be overnight or it's going to be the early morning, or whichever part of the day is the coldest, you'd say 12 hours you keep it on the heat mat, and then the next you take it off. But then that's a lot of work, right? So yeah, so put, like princesses, turn it on every other hour. But yeah, so try to regulate the temperature or move the bin every now and then, or turn off the heat mat every now and then, because you don't want to take chances. So if you already have a heat mat that you cannot control, the amount of heat that it puts out, then I'd recommend having a few hours that you keep it running and then you turn it off. But it is going to be a lot of work. So your next option might be, as I said, to put a buffer between the heat mat and the worm bin. But that depends on how hot your heat mat gets. Because mark you, sometimes you might be at work, so you don't really have time to turn it on and off every couple of hours. And sometimes, depending on the type of work you do, you might be out of town for a week, more than a week. So, depending on your circumstance, let that be what determines what type of heat mat you get. Now, what can you do if your worms are not eating your food scraps fast enough? Make sure that they are getting the right type of food. Like I mentioned before, acidic foods they will eat, but they will take a long time to eat that. So if you're feeding that to them, make sure you're not overwhelming the bin with that, because it is going to make your bin acidic. And when conditions in your bin is not right, even though the worms may or may not die, even though the worms might be carrying on, they're going to slow down. The best you can get out of your worms is when you make sure that all the conditions in the bin are ideal. It's not easy to make the condition in your worm bin ideal, because you have to take into consideration temperature, you have to take in consideration the moisture, the amount of food in the bin, whether you have enough bedding in the bin, if your bin is acidic, if your bin has enough airflow. So there are so many different factors that you have to keep in mind. And sometimes, even with the best effort that you put in, worms are sensitive to even as much as a 1 degree change in temperature. So therefore, it's not very easy to keep the conditions in your bin ideal. And even when you try your best, sometimes the barometric pressure from around the bin, the worms can sense that. So that too will have an effect on them. So if you find that your worms are not eating at the rate that you expect them to, then do not be adding more food to it, because if you do that, your bin can become anaerobic. It's going to become stinky. And if you have it in your house, it doesn't matter where you have it, you don't want it to be like that, because once it is anaerobic, it's going to become slimy, it's going to become smelly, it's going to attract pests. The worms are going to start dying off too, because they just can't live in an anaerobic environment. So when you stop adding food to the bin, you're going to allow the worms to work on what is already in the bin. If the amount of food scrap that is in the bin is so much that the worms, even though you're not feeding it, cannot keep up with it, then you might want to take some of that food scrap out and put it in your compost bin, or you can freeze it or store it however way you choose. And then after the worms finish processing what is in the bin, then you can give that back to them. Now, adding grit to your worm bin will also help the worms to process the food faster. So whether you're going to be using fine grain of sand, crushed oyster shell or crushed eggshell, diatomaceous earth, or any other form of grit, some seeds, the skin of the seeds can be blended and used as grit. There are quite a lot of things that you can use as grit for your worms. So if you find that your worms are not eating fast enough, these are some of the steps that you can take to help your worms to produce their food faster. LP says, okay. Barnfree says, great, thank you. Okay, you're welcome. LP says, and if you have a thermometer in there, you will be able to keep track of how the temperature fluctuates. Like she says, and her videos feed nitrogen rich food to help raise the temperature. Wrap blanket. Yes. Now, If you do not have a thermometer, and you're going to be getting a thermometer that you're going to be using in the worm bin as opposed to in the room that you have your worms, my recommendation would be to get one of those 3-in-1 um, thermometer, because when you get the 3-in-1, it tests the light in your worm bin, because it really is a soil tester. So it will test the light, amount of light that is in your worm bin. It will test the moisture that is in your worm bin and the temperature. I've been trying to find one of those 3-in-1s that test the pH, the acid, the pH, the moisture, and the temperature. But unfortunately, I've never been able to find one of those thermometer. It is always light. It is testing as opposed to so yeah. So if you can find one of those though that test the pH, moisture, and light, not light but temperature, that would be awesome. But yes, try to find one of those 3-in-1s, because you get more benefit from it, and they're pretty much the same price depending on the brand that you're getting. They're pretty cheap, because I get one of those 3-in-1, and it doesn't test temperature. It tests moisture, it tests pH, and light. So if I want, I probably would have to get the temperature one separately. But there are variations to those 3-in-1 testers. So do your research to see which one will work best for you. And they're pretty cheap, because I got mine for $8 something Canadian. So they're not really expensive. Hi, Little Farmer's Farm. How are you? You're here. You're not really considered late. Everybody is busy, so you come at the time when you can. Happy Thumbs 12 here. Okay, thank you. Yeah, so let's see. Where was I? Okay, so we were looking at what you can do if your worms are not eating fast enough. So making sure that the conditions in your worm bin is ideal is the best way to go to help your worms to eat faster, in addition to adding the grit to the worm bin. Now, if you want to start a worm bin, what type of worms should you get? This is another question that a lot of people who are contemplating starting a worm bin ask. And so that depends on several factors, such as climatic conditions and where you are living. So some live in regions where it is nice and warm all year round. Some live in region where it's not too bad. It's not really warm. It might get cold, but they're still able to have a worm bin outdoors. Or some might live in areas where when the winter comes, they just cannot have their worms outdoors. Little Farmer says, "Are red wigglers good?" Absolutely. So I'm going to be telling you about the most common type of worms, and how you can go about choosing which of them you can use. So for example, if you live in an environment where it is hot year round, or at least your winter is warm year round, where say you have 20 degrees Celsius in your winters, then you can get the blue worms or the African nightcrawlers, because these worms prefer the warmer environment than the cold. They don't do well in the cold unless you're going to be able to bring them indoors where it's warm. Now, if you live in colder areas that are very cold most of the year, you might want to consider Canadian nightcrawlers, because these worms just love to be cool. They absolutely hate the heat. So if you're living in a region where 7 to 9 months of the year it's cool or cold, then you might want to consider getting getting Canadian nightcrawlers. Mark you during the summer months, you're gonna have to find ways to keep them cool because they do not like heat. So you have to keep them cool or they will just either die depending on how hot it is, or they won't do anything at all. So when worms are going into the hibernative state, they don't hibernate, but I don't remember the term for what they do. Can in the winter, Canadian nightcrawlers do that in the summer if it is not cool enough. So they are a bit more work to maintain than the other type of composting worms. Let's see. Okay, my garden is saying hello from Manchester, UK. Okay, little farmer is saying hello to Granny's gardener. Okay, yeah. So the European night crawlers, now these are able to withstand a reasonable amount of cold and a reasonable amount of heat. Mark you, they don't like freezing temperatures. They can survive if they freeze for a short period of time, but Moses has said a very short period of time. So you don't want to allow them to freeze. But they can survive cold temperatures and they can survive a reasonable amount of heat. The red wigglers, they are the most adaptable worms. So red wigglers, they're able to adapt to cold and to heat. They will slow down and they will slow down drastically if the temperatures go down below 10 degrees Celsius, which is 50 degrees Fahrenheit, as LP says. So they can survive 10 degrees Celsius. They can survive being frozen for a very short period of time, maybe a few days, but during that time you're going to lose some of them. So it's best to keep them at 10 or above. But if you want them to operate at the best that they can do, whether it is cold outdoors, yes or no, you want to keep them anywhere between 2015 and above. So red wigglers are your best bet because they can survive drastic change better than all the other composting worms. Now, for you, little farmer, you are in Europe, so for you, the European night crawlers would do pretty good, or the red wigglers, because my sister and White gluten-free recipes, she is in the UK and she has her European night crawlers. They are outdoors. She never brings her worms inside. So the European night crawlers or the red wigglers would be a good option for you. Let's see. Why do the worms hang out at the top of your compost bin? So what type of worms do you have? Some worms are bottom feeders, some worms are top feeders. That does not mean that you're not going to find worms throughout your bin. You can still find worms throughout the bin. Some worms will come up to the surface, eat, and then go back down. Some worms will stay on the surface. Now, if a lot of food is on the surface, red wigglers are usually surface dwellers. If, however, the condition is in your bin is ideal, the worms are going to be right throughout your bin. It doesn't mean that if they're on the surface of your bin, it's because condition in your bin is not ideal. That can be the case, but it doesn't have to be the case. So let me explain. Some red wigglers like to live in the top 6 inches of your compost. But if you have food scraps and enough airflow and all of the conditions that the red wigglers like throughout the entire bin, their worms are going to be everywhere in the bin. However, if you are not turning the content of your bin, or if when you turn the content of your bin, you're turning the surface area of your bin and not the bottom portion of your bin, what you're going to find is that the bottom of your bin is going to be where the castings settle. Now, there won't be a lot of food scraps down there, so the worms are not going to be down there. Other types of worms, the night crawlers, they will be all over your worm bin. Sometimes it can be that your bin got a little too cold, a little bit too hot, so the worms just come up to the surface so that they can get enough air. Especially if you have a deep bin, that can be the case. So there are many reasons why the worms may choose to hang out on the top of your bin. What you need to do though is pay attention to how the worms look. Do they look as if they're okay? Are they on the side of the bin? Are they on the covers of the bin? Is it a lot of them on the side of the bin or a lot of them on the covers of the bin? Because if that is the case, then it would mean that there is something wrong in the bin. If it is that they're just hanging out on the surface of the bin, then that's not too bad. So you need to observe your worms. How do they look? Do they look happy? Do they look droopy? What are they doing? Because this is going to help you to figure out whether or not there is something wrong with the bin, why they're hanging out at the top of the bin. So yes, so just pay attention to how your worms look, and that can give you a pretty good idea of what is going on. Okay, so let's see. Little farmer says, just the ones in the garden. Could it be to mate? I don't really know. Most of the times when I find worm mating, they are usually hidden. They like their privacy. I've never really seen any on the surface baiting. I'm not saying that they don't, but they're usually down in the bin. So who knows? Let's see. And says, my worms are now on the surface of my bins. The bin is slightly open. Okay. Yeah, so as long as the bin has sufficient airflow and enough moisture, if your bin is too moist, they're going to come to the surface as well, because when your bin is too moist, it the moisture blocks all of the air pocket that is in the bin, so the worms cannot breathe properly, so they will come to the surface. So if your bin is not too moist, then that should be okay as well. So little farmers, is it that they're always dwelling on the surface, or is it that it's just sometimes that you will see them on the surface? Because if it is that they're always on the surface, then most likely the bin is quite fine, because that's the norm. They're just hanging out there. And sometimes they just want to come up and chill. And especially if the temperature is ideal outside, like humidity is good, they will tend to come to the surface, because especially if it is overcast or cloud, yes, because what is happening is that worms love the cool. They don't like the bright sunlight and all of that. So if it is a time of year when there isn't a lot of bright sunlight and the time is cloudy or it is overcast, things like that, and the humidity is right, they're going to want to come to the surface, because that environment feels more like what they find to be ideal. So they will even try to climb out of the bin because they want to explore, because they don't have the bright light now to dry them out or anything like that. And then sometimes, if your bin is overcrowded, they may choose to come to the surface as well, because then on the surface they're free to move around as much as they like without having to be bumping into all the worms that you have in your worm bin. Let's see, a little farmer says, great advice. Okay, so in the next 3 minutes, I'm going to be saying goodbye to you guys. It was so good having you on the live. Thank you for all your participation, your questions, and the knowledge that you shared with us. I'm looking forward to seeing you guys again on Monday for our gardening Q&A live. And for you, what's the name? What's the name? Oh, oh, my memory is so bad. Barnfree. Yes, I hope you'll be able to get the condition around your worms or in your worm bin, the temperature ideal so that your worms can keep producing and that they will be safe. So, all the best to all of you worm farmers and gardeners. Hope you'll stay safe. Let's see. My granny's garden says, "Good live. Thank you for sharing." Okay, you are very welcome. Love you too. Take care. Yeah, so have a lovely weekend, everyone. And I'll see you again on Monday.